Let me start by welcoming everybody again. This is part of my regular press conferences. We timed it so that we could accommodate having Mr. Chakrabarti here from DFID, but it's usually 5 to 6 weeks or so between each of my press conferences. So I'm very pleased to welcome Mr. Indranil Chakrabarti, who is the Deputy Director of Overseas Territories Department for DFID, and he's been here all week. As you will know, the DFID representative has usually done this press conference jointly with me, since many of the questions I am asked, as you know, because you ask them, have to do with DFID's role and their work here. So I'm very happy to welcome him to the press conference. So let me start with my general remarks. Really, I only have one topic today, and that is just some comments on the hurricane preparedness and response. But of course, when we open up to questions, you can ask questions on various topics. So front and center in our minds and hearts are the recent hurricanes that have done so much damage in our Caribbean neighborhood. So my first comments concern the suffering and destruction that Irma, Jose, and Maria have caused in the region. We all know that this is turning out to be an unusually volatile hurricane season. The destruction is profound for some islands, and we continue to offer our prayers and support to those who have been so badly affected. Even the small population of Montserrat, which was spared serious damage by these storms, has reached out with extraordinary generosity, giving whatever we could and showing solidarity with our neighbors. I know this spirit of neighborliness and deep connection is a hallmark of what it means to be Montserratian and something we can all be proud of. I'm pleased to say that Montserratian officials and people, for the most part, took preparations and response seriously on the island, and efforts in this respect were laudable. However, as in all cases where systems are tested by events, there were lessons to be learned that can help improve our preparations and response, as well as recovery. And more importantly, these lessons are helping us to understand how to build more resilience into the infrastructure and administrative practices on the island. We continue to grapple with ensuring that preparations are undertaken thoroughly and in a timely manner, although I believe our preparedness was much heightened this time, especially in getting ready for Maria. I have heard many people say that the fact that we so narrowly missed considerable destruction, as experienced by our neighbors, really woke them up to the need to be fully prepared. I also heard in my head something my mother would always say to me, which is better safe than sorry. We also learned that we need to ensure that should we need to enact emergency powers, as we must be prepared to do in the event of a disaster, that we have activated in advance a consultation mechanism beyond the NDPRAC, which you will know is the National Disaster Preparedness and Response Advisory Committee, which is the main committee for all the discussions around preparedness and response, which I chair. For the purpose of ensuring we are ready for any upcoming events, I have reconvened the constitutionally mandated National Advisory Council to advise the Governor on disaster emergency measures as well as strategic security issues. I am looking forward to the added value the Council can bring to our deliberations on Montserrat's strategic security issues in the longer term. And finally, one of the things we always learn during these episodes, we learned that communication, especially clear and consistent communication, is essential. We've tightened our communications approach and capability and have initiated a dialogue with ZJB to ensure that we have their insights on how this can best be undertaken. So I'll move to introduce Mr. Chakrabarti now. This week was a busy week with his visit. And I am sure that he'll communicate some of the outcomes and his impressions. So I'm going to let Mr. Chakrabarty introduce himself this morning and touch on that. If you wanted to make a few remarks, and then we'll open to questions. Okay.
Well, my thanks to Her Excellency the Governor, Premier Romeo, and the rest of the Cabinet for what has been an interesting week of discussions. I came to Montserrat keen to get a sense for myself of this island and the key issues the government and the people of Montserrat are facing. In the time available to me this week, I've spoken to as many people as I could, visited a number of government offices and departments, and seen various parts of the island for myself.
My name is Narissa Golden. I'm with Discover Montserrat.
Bennett Roach from the Montserrat Reporter, editor, and you name it.
James White from Radio Montserrat.
Okay, so we'll begin as we usually do with questions to either of us on the topics we've covered, or if you have questions around other issues as well. So who'd like to start?
Yeah. Good morning again, Bennett Roach. Your Excellency, a few things. First thing, I note you mentioned, and it's of concern because I have questions surrounding that. You said you chair NDPRAC.
Yes.
My recollection is that, from going back as far as I can remember, that it's co-chair between yourself and the President.
No, if you look at the legislation, it's very clear that it is the governor who chairs the NDPRAC. It's in the disaster preparedness legislation. I can't remember the section, but it's very clear the makeup of the committee and who chairs.
Yeah, that's quite a huge committee, that NDPRAC.
Yes, it's
consisting mostly, if not entirely, of public servants,
Well, actually, that it doesn't. If you look at the legislation, it's quite restricted to restricted
like that word,
to key decision makers, ministers, and some key decision makers. What has been happening is that the EOC, which is the operational part, which is delegated by NDPRAC and authorized by the governor, has been, in times when we're pressed for time, has been meeting at the same table with the NDPRAC. But towards the end of the process, we separated them out because actually it's quite inefficient to have that number of people at the table. And it takes a long time because the operational issues are actually discussed by the policymakers where they probably should be decided and then brought to the policymakers. So that, as I mentioned, we've looked at some of the administrative changes that we can do to make our whole response more efficient. So we've gone back to the legislation, and we're sticking much more closely to what the legislation says.
Governor, now that we're past Maria and Irma, is there any plans to look at what happened in the other islands and then begin to make sure our processes taken into consideration, especially the aftermath of a storm such as what we saw on the other islands?
Well, the whole process that's done through the NDPRAC and our whole disaster, in fact, our disaster legislation is based on standards that are throughout the islands and other OTs. So I think the process itself, as on paper and in the law, is fairly good. I think where we need strengthening is ensuring that people really are serious, especially in preparedness, and especially part of preparedness is quite bureaucratic, actually. It's putting office plans together, it's writing them up, it's getting them into NDPRAC, it's making sure that they conform to a regular standard. And I think that is quite hard to do. The other thing is ensuring that we have identified actions that we need to take and budgets that will support those actions, such as shuttering and ensuring that our shelters are prepared and so on, and backup systems are there. And one of the key learning points, I think, that has come out for us, and certainly you can see it in the language where it's being described what's happening now in the response and moving to recovery processes in some of the other islands, is this issue of resilience. So resilience means, you know, to what degree you can withstand a shock or a disaster. And it is quite far-reaching. I mean, it moves all the way from the robustness of your infrastructure. It moves into things like, do you have backup generators? Are they maintained? Do we have the right equipment after an event where we need to move things from place to place or quickly clear roads or whatever? Do we have all the way to more profound infrastructure issues, such as are our connectivity mechanisms well in place? A lot of our connectivity, as you know, went down during the storms, even when we were passed in a minor way, and that has to do with the private sector as well as the public sector. It has to do with the quality. We have telephone lines above ground, for example. That is a big risk during storms, and we know we're going to have storms. We relied very much on our providers around communications, mobile networks, and television, and so on. That obviously we suffered because we don't have a fiber optic cable, unlike all the other islands, and so on. So things went down, and that in the long term, we know that we need to build that resilience. And if you note the comments that are coming from the UK government, I just noted Chris Austin, who now they've set up a different mechanism, the UK government, for responding to the Caribbean events. So they actually have a senior person located in Barbados who has a task force who's pulling together all the efforts. And I think that's quite unique for the UK. And they've noted, for example, I think is in Minister Priti Patel's remarks, to build she says, our UK task force is now working with the government of the overseas territories to help them get on with the vital reconstruction work and make sure the islands are built back more resiliently than in the past, so a future hurricane won't be as devastating. So I think that's a feature that I think is very welcome.
Good. I'm really glad to hear that, because that was going to be my next question to you, sir, is where does Montserrat fit into that overseas territory plan? And how will DFID approach any future development projects? Because the governor mentioned fiber optics. We still don't have that. All of these things have been stalled in one way or the other. So what's the plan to absolutely make sure Montserrat is positioned for and more resilient? Because we use the word a lot, but we use it in relation to people being strong and stoic. But clearly, as a nation, how resilient are we if we were to have a disaster such as Maria or Irma?
Okay, thank you very much. DFID is currently providing about £30 million worth of funding per year to Montserrat. Montserrat continues to be an overseas territory which is eligible for overseas development assistance, and DFID continues to meet the reasonable needs of the people of Montserrat. Part of my discussions this week were with government. We touched extensively on the question of resilience, question of building back better, and the UK government will be keen to play an integral part in leveraging and partnering with governments locally, international financial institutions and the private sector towards that effort.
I should also add that the government, this government, the government of Montserrat, has immediately, at the end of the passing of the storm Maria, we have put together a task force called the Resilience Task Force, where we've started to identify the short-term, sort of 6 to 12-month things, and then the longer-term things that we need to think about in terms of resilience, and started to cost them and look at how we put those into our planning So I think that's a really positive outcome too. So that, it's anything, as I said, from making sure we have backup generators to longer term issues that strengthen and make more robust our infrastructure.
Just listening to you, Your Excellency, speaking about the plans in the aftermath of the hurricanes, I hope that we have documented the lessons learned and to factor these in our planning
Yes.
going forward.
Very good point, and we're in the process of documenting them. And we've got quite a bit written up already, but we want to draw in from different, including, for example, the media, and through the group that Mr. Roach mentioned.
Okay. In the same light, it's been rumored that there was a plan to invoke a state of emergency at some point in time. What even triggered this thought?
Okay, I think that's useful to clarify that because a lot of people don't understand that. Every time we have a disaster approaching, the documents for declaring a state of emergency or proclaiming a state of emergency are prepared. And those documents are for the governor to sign. We did that, as we always do. We did that for Eric and Danny. We did it for these storms. And in anticipation, that was, I think, on the 20th. So that was just before we sort of knew the full situation and what kind of response we could expect from the UK, for example. We weren't sure if we were getting a ship coming or whatever. So I signed the document, but that does not mean that there was a declaration, because it has to be gazetted. So in anticipation that we would need, for example, to requisition buildings if we had a ship coming in, and they would need a point of assembly and so on. So after seeing over the weekend the degree of response, and I have to say that Montserrat really pulled it together. It was quite phenomenal. And then we had a better idea of both the amount of damage that we had, as well as what kind of assistance we were getting. You'll remember that we did have a helicopter, the Chinook helicopter, that landed with a number of armed force people, Army people who came, who helped out with some of the reconstruction. And it became obvious that it wasn't needed. So it was never proclaimed. So there was no state of emergency. There was just a preparation for a state of emergency. And I really want to clarify that. So, however, it is very important that we understand the whole process. And I think what this instance brought to light was that I don't think we were as prepared as we should have been. Because we need to have more consultation, but we need to have consultation outside of the NDPRAC, because although we talked about that quite a bit in the NDPRAC, it needs to be outside. And there is this body, the National Advisory Committee, that is mandated in the Constitution. It hasn't met for 5 years. Nobody's called it. It hasn't met. And when I looked into it, and I looked into the kind of activity that they did when they met in 2012, and what the Constitution said about what their responsibilities were with regard to security in general, but also with regard to emergencies, I thought it would be important to convene that group very quickly, which I have done. And I've given them a challenge to think about a more strategic role than I think they were embarking on in 2012, which was to review the police report. That was really the bulk of what they did then, and actually to be continuously advising on both security issues and emergency issues. And I think it will help us a lot to tighten up the way that the NDPRAC functions and the way that our mechanisms function. And I should say, actually, that the NDPRAC, all the members of the NAC are actually on the NDPRAC already, with the exception of the Leader of the Opposition. So that is the difference of the Council and the NDPRAC. So the NDPRAC contains more members than the NAC, but the NAC also includes the leader of the opposition.
I'm very happy, Your Excellency, that you clarified the whole process. And in terms of education, and I'm glad that you raised it, because it's about empowering the community,
Yes.
so that giving them the information, they'll be able to transform that information into knowledge, so
Yeah.
that they can take decisive action. And I'm very happy that you clarified
Well,
that.
I'm really completely with you on that one, Mr. White, because one of the things I think really came, we did the general communications and so on, but one of the things that really impressed me this time, and I've said to Anesta, who's my communications person, I want to do a series on exactly what the legislation is, exactly what the governor's powers are, exactly what the council's powers are, how all that works, because at a time when you're under stress, and you're worried and you're anxious, you wonder what's happening. You wonder who's in charge. You wonder where all of this is coming from. And during this time, hopefully of lull, I want to focus on that in several sessions, I think, the public sessions.
Also, Your Excellency, on backing up, there was also a rumor of plans to construct a military base on island.
Really?
I'm hearing it's being rumored.
Really?
So
Well, I have no idea where that would have come from. There are no plans to construct a military base, except we need to strengthen the support that we provide to the Royal Montserrat forces, our defense force, because they don't actually have a permanent base. So that would be my focus. There's no reason to have a military base. However, if we had an emergency, as in, say, BVI and other places, do you know that there were over 2,000 British troops deployed in the whole area? So if you're at a point where everything is in destruction, you might need to requisition a building, for example, if you have soldiers and other workers who are there, so that they can use that as a headquarters. But there is absolutely no intent. We have a defense force here, and they're very capable.
just looking at the whole idea of the aftermath of the hurricanes, and Montserrat was virtually spared. When we look at the other islands that were impacted, has the trigger been given for an assessment of the damage?
Yes.
What is the situation
underway.
as we speak?
Well, that is underway, and I'm looking at a number of assessments that are now being brought together in one. And I think the financial secretary, I've asked for the presentation of that for the resilience group to consider as well. It's not as high as it has been, obviously, in other places, but it does run into the millions. And it's different kinds of damage. It's damage to private infrastructure, to public infrastructure. It's damage to our power. It's damage to our water supply. And all those kinds of things, where things had to be repaired, or where we had to bring in temporary measures such as generators from other places and so on to back things up.
Okay. All right. Let me get the name right, Mr. Chakrabarti. That's correct. Okay. Just following on from a couple of questions that my colleague, Ms. Golden, asked. The Honourable Premier last month criticized the British government for not adequately addressing Montserrat's most urgent needs, basic needs, which the Premier declared or identified as housing, fiber optics, the hospital, such transformational projects. What is the situation?
Okay. Well, I had a good visit to the island. I visited a number of sites, had a number of discussions this week with the Premier and other government ministers, as well as with officials. And we had a number of productive discussions with those officials and with those cabinet members about the issues you've set out, infrastructure and others. And I think we're in a clearer position on next steps. And it's for Government of Montserrat really to take forward those next steps.
Okay, added on as well, having seen the devastation wrought on the islands from the various hurricanes that passed through, the overseas territories' economies have been impacted. Mm-hmm. What's the FIS position on the provision of funding to complete the government's housing regeneration project? And I'm specifically talking about here in Montserrat.
Okay. Well, as I just said, we've I've visited some of the housing units. Have had discussions with relevant ministries and the cabinet about that, and we've agreed a way forward. The action now rests with Government of Montserrat on that.
Mm. We've heard a lot of that. It's up to the Government of Montserrat, But the government, they are approaching 3 years of their term in office. What is the likelihood that DFID would be approving funding or new funding for projects going forward?
Well, we have to take everything on a case-by-case basis to see the case being made, look at value for money, look at impact, look at all those issues. I'm not in a position now to say what we will fund, when we will fund it, but we will take the approach that we've always taken. We'll look at impact, we'll look at purpose, we'll look at value for money, and we'll have ample discussions with government, and we'll come to a mutually agreed position.
With all respects, Mr. Chakrabarti, you mentioned earlier that you are aware of the impact that has been wrought on the islands. Now, with that knowledge, it's against that background that I'm asking, what are the provisions you've seen for yourself, and you've heard of the impact in other countries? There must be something concrete that you can put in place to ensure that Montserrat does not suffer the same fate.
Well, as I said, we've had those discussions this week with Government of Montserrat. We looked at various options. The next steps now lie with the Government of Montserrat. The reconstruction in the other islands, as you mentioned, and the badly affected overseas territories, will be a joint government, private sector, international financial institution effort. And the UK government stands ready to facilitate and leverage support for that reconstruction effort.
Mr. Chakrabarti, how long you've been deputy head for different department?
I think about 4 months.
4 months. Also, you're relatively new.
Relatively new.
So that, because I'm noticing from your responses that there's nothing we can glean that is materially important to anything we're really asking. But let me say something about this fiber optic stuff. This fiber optics matter, and I don't know whether you can help us help me on this. The fiber optics
Can you get a glass of water? Yeah.
is a big loss and an extremely snail-moving matter for Montserrat. It had been to the point where tenders were sent out, and how we do this, for the fiber optics, people to respond and so on and so on. And it dropped dead. That is of September last year. We know, and I've investigated, and I know a lot about what has in fact happened. Is it your understanding that what I'm saying is correct, that the fiber optics thing was well on its way to take place, and that the slowness of it, the absence of it, has really been one of a major setback in Montserrat's development? The governor made a reference to the fact that it was unavailable during the crisis. In fact, when the business case was put up, those are some of the things that were mentioned, why it's so absolutely necessary that we have this. What the governor is not mentioning is that our communications suffered seriously because of some problems we had with our local infrastructure as far as that goes. If we had fiber optics, we would not be in such bad shape. Am I correct so far that this matter had been well on the way, but it was stopped? Are you familiar with that, sir?
Okay, well, thank you for that. I mean, as I said, I've had a number of discussions about fibre optics this week with relevant stakeholders here on the island. It's not really for me to lay out what the next steps are. It's with the relevant stakeholders here to set those out. But as with the broader reconstruction effort, it will require a joint government-private sector, potentially IFI effort. And I know that the government of Montserrat are now considering the next steps around this.
So why a joint venture at this point? This matter, your UK media took this matter up foolishly, I'll admit, and talked about giving Montserrat aid, £5 million aid for something that is not available in Montserrat, when they had 2 weeks before published about £60 million that were being given to somebody else. So it was kind of stupid. Your minister responded to them, a spokesperson for the minister. I don't know which minister that was. I can find out who he was at the time. Reminded them that Montserrat might as well be sitting someplace in Britain. That's how they're supposed to treat us. So when you're now telling me that the plan is for us to do a joint venture, £4.94 million was already approved, earmarked, and already spelled out into, I'm looking here, between 2016 and 17, £0.5 million was to be spent, and that was being spent. And then 27-18, the rest 4.4. What am I hearing now, sir? That now it has to be a joint venture between Montserrat and the British government?
So I think what you're hearing, sir, is the UK government stands ready to facilitate and leverage support necessary to meet the reasonable infrastructure needs of Montserrat.
And I'm trying to find out, why are we going backwards?
Mr. Roach, I think you've got the answer that Mr. Chakrabarty is able to give you, so I think we should move on to another question.
The one that he's able to give me. Very well. And you, Your Excellency, on this same matter, how did we sit here knowing that as of September last year, this matter was well on its way? And it's October now, 12 months later. What can you tell me about that?
Well, I don't comment on DFID, Government of Montserrat negotiations, and that's what that is. You should hear directly from the Government of Montserrat or DFID on that matter.
Well, you just heard James mention that they complained about it. I can't expect to hear anything further. Anyhow, let us record our disappointment from this position. With regards to that state of emergency, quote, state of emergency that was never published, are you being forthright with us as to how that actually happened, Your Excellency?
I beg your pardon?
Are you being forthright with us as to
what do you mean by that
was
question, Mr. Roach?
By that question, ma'am, I am suggesting to you that that state of emergency was nothing that was prepared in advance of anything. Besides, maybe I should ask you, how is the state of emergency, which we don't call it state, a public emergency, how is it invoked?
Okay, so that's a good question. And as I mentioned before, documents are always prepared at the beginning of a disaster. I sign a number of documents. For example, I embody the Defense Force. I declare that an emergency or a disaster is approaching. I declare that there has been a disaster, and so on. Those are documents that I'm required to sign in order that we can take the actions that we need to take. Okay, so that's, and the emergency document is one of those documents.
That particular document was in respect of what?
Beg your
Exactly.
pardon?
That particular document was in respect of what?
I don't understand your question.
I did ask you, though, how is it's invoked. How do you invoke it? What are the steps that you take to invoke a public
I've
emergency?
already outlined that the steps that are taken, if it is actually enacted, involve looking at the situation and consulting. And actually, if you look at the Constitution, you will see that part of that consultation should be with the NAC. Now, that motion or that document was not enacted, so there was no state of emergency. Okay? So I want to be clear on that. There was no emergency proclamation
Your
that was
Excellency.
legally enacted.
Your Excellency,
Are you harassing me, Mr. Roach?
you can call that whatever you wish.
Well, I think
Your
I'm going
Excellency.
to bring this line of questioning to a close
Well,
because
you-
we've reached the end
well,
of
the thing is-
we've reached the end of our time, and I thank you for your questions. And I can assure you that in times coming up, I will go into a lot of detail about what all the legal requirements are. And I think that we all are learning this together for sure, because I think a lot of people have misconceptions about it. So I want to set those right and make sure the public has the information they need. And I will be doing that in the coming weeks. So I want to thank everybody for their participation. And we've now reached the end of the time for this particular session. There will be other sessions, of course, press conferences, and we can revisit these issues.